Search for God Conference. And today we have a presentation by a very special speaker, somebody that's been involved with A.R.E. for many, many years. It's Dr. Mark Thurston. He is a psychologist, an author, and lecturer, and educator. And he worked at the A.R.E. from 1973 through 2008. Since that time, the last 9 years, he's been a faculty member as the director of educational programs for George Mason University's Center for the Advancement of Well-Being. Among his publications and many books are two that are based and keyed towards the search for God material. The books are Experiments in a Search for God and Experiments in Practical Spirituality. He's also the author of The Essential Edgar Cayce, and most recently, Discovering Your Soul's Purpose, second edition. Mark and his wife of 37 years, quite an achievement, Mary Elizabeth Lynch, also lead small group course intensives through their nonprofit educational organization, which is Personal Transformation and Courage Institute. I've known and worked with Mark since the very early 1990s. And I can say that few epitomize living the course or the search for God material as he. He has a countenance of serenity. He's unflappable. Never saw him stressed. His writings and presentations helped our understanding also of the material in the search for God. So if I could offer you and introduce you to Dr. Mark Thurston. Give him a warm welcome back to the A.R.E. Glad that he's here.
Sure.
Thank you.
Good here. Great. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Gary, it's really good to see you back working at the A.R.E. again. That's great. Yeah. So this New Year's conference used to be kind of a really special point in my life. We began the New Year's conference in 1969. I was here. There were about 200 people, almost all college students. This building didn't yet exist. The auditorium was part of what's used to be called the Wynn Building, and now has kind of been wrapped around and looks like a brand new building. And it was really an exciting time. I think it was surprising to Charles Thomas Cayce, who organized the conference, that so many young people would show up. And it became kind of an annual event that for many, many years was largely a youth conference. Later it kind of morphed into being multi-generational. I think I was at the first 32 of them. I kind of had a leg up on that because it was part of my job to be there for many of those years. And it used to start on December 27th, and I would usually be with my parents in the DC suburbs, and there was a certain ritual to going up there for Christmas and then driving back down here on the 27th for the beginning of the New Year's conference. So lots of good memories about this event, and I'm really pleased to get a chance to be a speaker this year for the program. So my own history with the A Search for God material is almost 50 years. And 2018 will be the 50th year anniversary for me getting into an A Search for God study group. The backstory is that as a high school student, I'd started reading books about Edgar Cayce. I'd seen Hugh Lynn Cayce and Jess Stern on the Mike Douglas talk show. Anybody remember Mike Douglas? This is an old enough group that there are people that remember. If I were to say that to my college students, they'd think I was from another planet, or I'd been playing a video game that had some avatar named Mike Douglas on it or something. I was so taken by this interview and Jess Stern talking about the sleeping prophet. I went out and started buying books about Edgar Cayce's work. One of which was Elsie Sechrist's book, Dreams Your Magic Mirror. It was a hard copy book, and it had sort of a three-dimensional seeing eye on the front. Does anybody Remember that? And so when I went off to college, to Houston, I had noticed on the back dust jacket that Elsie and Bill Sechrist lived in Houston, Texas. And I figured they'd be thrilled to know that as an 18-year-old, I was going to be in Houston also. So I got to Houston, I looked up in the phone book, no Elsie Sechrist, but there was a Wilfred Sechrist, or I knew that was her husband's name. So I just called him up. And apparently they used to get a lot of calls like that. Elsie was on the Art Link letter show regularly, interpreting dreams on the spot, and she had quite a following with her book publications. But Bill Sechrist told me about the study group program and how they had several dozen study groups in the Houston area, and there was even one that was very near the Rice University campus. And he knew the leader of the group, which was a guy about 30 years old, would be thrilled to come pick me up if I wanted to join the group. So every Wednesday for my freshman year of college, Carl Bohannon would come over and pick me up on campus and take me to my first study group experience. I was really obnoxious in this group. I had questions about everything. It had to all make sense in a very linear, logical way. Carl was so patient with me. I'm pretty sure I remember that I dedicated the Experiments in a Search for God book to him for his patience with me. But it really made a big impression on me, especially those 2 years in Houston. And then when I decided I wanted to move into psychology instead of the sciences, I transferred to the University of Texas at Austin and got into a A.R.E, Search for God study group there that was really pivotal for my life. There were about a dozen of us. Many of us have stayed friends for lots of decades. And in many, many ways, the work that I did in a Search for God study group during my junior and senior year of college informs the work I'm doing now as a faculty member at a university dealing with 21-year-olds. Not that I'm teaching a Search for God in the university classroom, but just the sense of community and the value of social support and mindfulness and consciousness studies and life purpose that was so vital for me when I was 20, 21, 22 years old. I feel like in sort of a positive karmic circle sort of way, I'm getting a chance to give back to university students today. Then as Gary mentioned, 2 of the early books I had a chance to write were directly keyed to the chapters in Book 1 and Book 2 of Search for God material. Less known is that the first of 2 books I wrote about dream interpretation is also key to the Search for God chapters. The book is cleverly titled How to Interpret Your Dreams. I'm not sure whether it's even in print anymore. It came out in 1978, but there's copies in the library. And so I took things like cooperation, and what does it mean to cooperate with your unconscious? So you can begin to even remember your dreams, and know thyself, and how do dreams help us to know ourselves, and how do dreams help us understand our ideals, or how do our ideals help shape the character of our dreams, and so forth. I think these themes in A Search for God have a lot of relevance to dream psychology as well. And then just a couple of years ago, when I had a chance to rewrite the Discovering Your Soul's Purpose book, I decided I wanted to use some of the Search for God themes in that and kind of create a different architecture for that book, and to especially focus the first half of the book on using the first 4 chapters of A Search for God as sort of a pathway for how we go about finding our calling in life. And that's sort of my theme for this morning. Sort of that same pattern that I used in the second edition of Discovering Your Soul's Purpose. Now, as I told my wife this morning as we were having breakfast, this talk is going to be all over the place. And maybe a better way of framing this is I'm going to try to create a collage. Okay? And I'd like to create a collage where at the end, if we kind of step back and look at it from a bit of a distance, we see some overall themes and patterns, and all these things kind of work together in a harmonious and integrative way. But a lot of times with a collage, there's individual pictures or individual images in the whole that are of particular interest to a viewer, and they want to kind of zoom in and look more carefully at certain images. So as I'm putting a lot of things out there this morning, my guess is there may be a few of the subjects that really appeal to you more and would be things you'd want to explore and get into with your own inquiry a little bit deeper. How's that for an excuse for a disorganized lecture? Yeah. Now, another way of putting this would be I want to use the scaffolding of A Search for God, especially the first 4 lessons, which I think are really pivotal. If we use the scaffolding of those first 4 lessons, how do they inform a lot of things about life? And here I'm talking as much about internal scaffolding as I am external scaffolding. I think sometimes we hear the word scaffolding and we think of it as sort of structures that are put up outside of a building to wash the windows or repair the bricks or what have you. But I think there can also be scaffolding that's more internal and eventually invisible, sort of like a skeleton on which the flesh and the bones and the nerves can be hung for the human body. So in a way, I think the Search for God lessons are like the internal skeleton of a whole philosophy of life. And if I can make sort of an editorial aside, and since I have the floor, I get to make asides. I was wondering just the other day, if I were just getting started with this material again, and I had 50 years ahead of me to try to do something that would make a contribution to the legacy of the Cayce material and to being helpful in the world, what would that be? I'm not going to live for 50 more years, so this is totally hypothetical and speculative. And the answer that came to me is that I think what A.R.E. needs is to take a lot of the core concepts that are in the readings and to treat them kind of like scaffolding and see what kind of modern research and contemporary life experiences can be sort of hung on that skeletal architecture to flesh out 21st century versions of spirituality and transformation. So it's kind of a delicate balance, because on the one hand, if we just keep selling the same Mark Thurston books that have been in print for 30 years, people are going to go elsewhere. Or if we just keep saying, here's the readings, here's the readings, here's the readings, every year they're a year older. So we've got to do something that makes this material alive without losing the essence of it. So sort of in that spirit, I'd like to this morning take the first 4 lessons of A Search for God and think together with you, okay, what can be hung on that skeleton? What can that be scaffolding for that helps us understand our own lives more deeply? So if somebody were to ask me, what's The Search for God really all about? I think there's 2 central learning themes in that material. First, I would say that material is trying to teach us that life is meaningful, that life makes sense, that there's rhyme and reason and order to our life experience, that there are universal laws that can be understood in a very practical way and applied in a very practical way, that life is meaningful, that life makes sense. So there's a big M meaning. That's sort of the meaning of life for everybody, the meaning that we all share. And then there's kind of a little m meaning that is your individual calling in life. I think in a lot of ways, the Search for God material was trying to get people to the point where intuitively they could grasp what their own calling is. And if you look at a lot of the 262 readings and the 281 readings, which are the prayer group readings, and that was a group that was a subset of the first A Search for God group, the people who were getting those readings were often getting individual messages at the end of the reading. There'd be, is there a message for so-and-so? Is there a message for so-and-so? And I think as they were applying the Search for God teachings, they were getting closer and closer to their own life calling. And Cayce was giving them little individual mini life readings, little pieces of advice just to them about trusting that call and being about applying that call. So to me, that's a first kind of central learning objective of the Search for God material, that life is meaningful. And the second, in my mind, is all about social support, that soul growth is optimized by working within the context of a like-idealed, mutually supportive group. That was a mouthful, wasn't it? Social support, that soul growth is optimized by working within the context of a mutually supportive group that shares a sense of ideal. They may have different ideas, but they have a commonality of ideal. And the material can be studied solo, but for anybody who's been in a group, I think they've experienced just how enriching it is to be doing that journey with others. this leads me to another aside. Now some of you have heard me tell this story multiple times, but I kind of enjoy telling it about once every 5 years. So, lucky day, it's been 5 years since I told it. When I got out of college and graduated from the University of Texas at Austin, I moved here to Virginia Beach with no promise of a job. But before moving here in 1972, I went on the first A.R.E. youth tour. And it was from mid-September into mid-October 1972. It was 30 days. We went to like 11 countries. There were 50 of us. Anybody want to guess what the price was? $750. Yeah. Okay. We stayed in some youth hostels, but yeah, it was a bargain. And one of the places that I was especially looking forward to going to was to go to Egypt and go to the Great Pyramid. You know, I'd read this stuff in the Cayce material about Jesus had had an initiation in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. You know, as a 22-year-old, I was ready to get initiated. Yeah, where do I sign up? And so the day finally arrived after having traveled through a lot of places in Europe, and we'd had to go into Jordan. No, we went to Egypt, then to Jordan, then to Israel. But the day comes when we're going to go from our budget hotel in downtown Cairo out to the Giza Plateau to spend the day out there. And Charles Thomas Cayce was the leader of the group, and he slipped the guardsman outside the gate some extra money to keep everybody else out for an hour. And our group went up into the King's Chamber to have a meditation time together. I was so excited I couldn't get calm and quiet. You know, here I'd come a third of the way around the world. I was sure I was going to have an out-of-body experience, or, you know, have some mythical God come and tell me the secrets of the universe or something. And I just couldn't get quiet to really get still to have a good meditation time. So it had been interesting to be in there. We came back out, and we were told we had 3 hours of free time, that we could just wander around, go down to the Sphinx, which is nearby, or go over to one of the other pyramids. There's 2 others there. And I decided I hadn't gotten what I'd come for. So I walked around on the other kind of 180 degrees around on the pyramid and climbed up on the side a ways. And many of you know it's not smooth surfaced anymore. For a long time it hasn't been. So you can kind of go up 3 feet and over 2 feet and up 2 feet and over 3 feet. It's big limestone blocks. So I climbed up a ways and I found a nice little shelf to sit down cross-legged to keep meditating. And very rarely in my life up to that point, or even since, has something sort of happened to me when I was sitting there meditating. But in this meditation, it's like something opened in my forehead and I had like a vision. I saw myself, and no, it wasn't 10,000 years ago, or in my little visionary experience, I was in a business meeting. Oh man, sitting around a table, it's sort of a business meeting. And I knew my identity in this little experience was that I was a staff member working at the A.R.E. Now I was planning to move here. I didn't have a promise of a job, but in this little experience, I know I'm a staff member working at A.R.E. And people are sitting around this table, maybe 8 or so, and there was this conversation going on that had a lot of energy to it, and I could immediately feel that everybody had a different idea about what we ought to do. And there was a sense of common ideal in the room, just sort of the vibe of that, respect and common purpose. But everybody had a different idea. And I felt I was listening to different people's point of view, and I was getting ready to argue from my point of view. And this little voice inside of me said, "Be still, be still." The work of the A.R.E. is not so much that lectures would be given and conferences held or books be written, as important as those things may be, but instead the purpose is that a new way of being with each other would be born into the earth. And I kind of came to, sitting there on the side of the pyramid. Now that's stuck with me for a long time, through my 36 years working here, and still does. And I think it speaks to what I'm suggesting as a second sort of theme or learning objective for the Search for God material. And it has to do with how we kind of grow together. We're in this game to learn a new way of being with each other. that has autonomy, it has individuality, it has the capacity to speak up for oneself, but it also has respect and a sense of how we're wiser together and we grow together. And I think if you work through a group setting with a Search for God material, you get a really good taste of exactly how that can work. So I'm going to do a lot of talking at the beginning and then very little. I've learned working with 22-year-olds, you really can't talk more than 10 or 15 minutes, and then they tune you out. I'm counting on you all being able to do about 40 minutes here with me, and then we're going to start doing things, okay? But, I want to suggest to you that there's a certain wisdom to the idea of a learning sequence. You got to sort of first things first, that notion, that until you learn something, you can't really learn something else. Now, I realize that it isn't always like that. There may be certain things we learn in life by just kind of jumping in, and there's lots of different angles by which you can do it, and you eventually pick up the skills you didn't learn and so forth. But there's other things about life that are much more sequential, that you got to do this before you can do that. Okay? You got to be able to stand up before you can walk. You got to walk before you can run, and so forth. So if we think about our traditional schooling, mathematics is pretty much like this. You got to learn to count, and then you can learn addition and subtraction, and then you can learn division and multiplication, and then maybe you can learn algebra, and maybe you can learn calculus, but you can't just jump in with algebra. There's a learning sequence. And could this also apply to sort of consciousness studies as well? In introducing me, Gary mentioned that Mary Elizabeth and I and a friend named Rudy Wilhelm founded 17 years ago a sort of special purpose institute, Personal Transformation and Courage Institute. And it continues to operate, running sort of small group learning intensives with between 8 and 15 people at a time, with a certain measure of emotional intensity that's not typical to a Search for God study group. And we've developed a certain learning sequence with that material. We have 4 3-day courses that are sort of fundamental to what we're trying to do around personal transformation. We've arranged them into sort of a sequence. Vision and Courage, 3 days about what does courage mean? How do we awaken the will so that we can live courageously? What's our vision for our life? And then 3 paths of transformation. What are 3 traditional pathways by which people change and grow? And do we know ourselves deeply enough that we can see what our own go-to transformative style is? And then another 3 days about intuition and guidance and ideals. And then finally a 3-day program about awakening the compassionate heart and heart consciousness. And it's possible to do those out of order, but I think when they're in a sequence and when it's the same group of people working together in a cohort, much like in a Search for God study group, that we really see a richness of personal growth that happens that isn't possible otherwise. If anybody's interested in that program, we can talk to you about it. We are always thrilled to work with people with that program. Another example of this comes from the work of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. Did Judith talk about Gurdjieff and Ouspensky last night? Yeah. So I didn't hear her talk, so maybe I'm going to end up repeating myself a little bit. But I first heard about them, I guess, just because Ouspensky's mentioned in the readings. He's one of a very small number of people that Edgar Cayce suggested as non-biblical resources to study. And then I heard about him because Hugh Lynn Cayce used to have a list of 20 books. Oh, Judith, you're there. Hi. Yeah. And sorry I missed your talk last night, but Hugh Lynn used to have a list of 20 books that he recommended, and one was The New Man by Maurice Nicoll, which I always thought was Nicole, but then a woman who used to be a student of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky who retired here in Virginia Beach, and I used to take my Atlantic University students over to see her, said, no, it was Maurice Nicoll. And so he wrote a book about the parables of Jesus, interpreted through the lens of Ouspensky and Gurdjieff's teachings. And also Jungian psychology. Maurice Nicoll was a psychiatrist. He was being, in a sense, prepared to be Carl Jung's successor. And then in the 1920s, he met Ouspensky and realized that's the material he wanted to devote his life to. And he was rooted in the Bible. He had this background in Jungian psychology. I think it's just brilliant the way he's able to bring a lot of wisdom to understanding that material. And again, it has this link back to the Cayce readings because of Cayce's positive feelings about Ouspensky. So in that material, and one of the many, many teachings is the notion of an orderly way in which we grow and progress, the so-called law of the octave. And we can kind of represent it like the do, re, mi scale. And it's especially the first 4 notes of the scale that say something to us about how we grow and unfold. So do, re, mi, fa. And if we were to think about how that would look on a piano keyboard, we got like middle C, and then D, and then E. And if you can imagine it, there's also a black key between do and re, and there's a black key between re and mi. But then to try to get up to fa, the 4th note, there's a missing semitone. Okay, there's a missing black key there. And so these teachings suggest that that's something that's illustrative about the transformation process. That the sounding of do in us is especially when we respect and value the work. We respect and value the teachings. So it's one thing, for example, to pick up the Search for God book and say, this looks pretty interesting. Yeah, it was written back in 1930 whatever, it's been around for a long time. Looks like it might go on my bookshelf and maybe once in a while I'll read it. It's another thing to pick it up and say, whoa, there's really something here. I place some heart-centered energy and some valuation on what's here. I'm really going to put some heart energy into this. See, there's a difference between kind of intellectual curiosity and kind of a reverence towards the work or towards teachings. The re is then taking the ideas and really beginning to apply them to yourself, not just spouting them off. Oh, guess what I learned at study group last night? No, it's like, here's something I can get my teeth into and try in my own life to be a personal researcher. That's the second note. The third note, do, re, mi, is the resistance that invariably arises once we start trying to apply. Yeah? So maybe you hear the idea that it's interesting to try to get up at 2 a.m. and meditate. Okay, yeah, I can value that. And then re, okay, I'm going to try it. I'm going to get up. I'm actually going to do it. And then the resistances that come in, okay? The excuses, the people that don't like the idea you're doing it and they give you external pushback, but it's really just an externalization of your own internal resistances. We all experience this, right? To move forward anymore, there's this missing semitone. At least this is what Gurdjieff and Ouspensky were saying. And there has to be what they call the first conscious shock, which is something needs to be brought in because that black key's not there that can move us to fa. And if we can move to fa, we really begin to move beyond just the conditioned personality self, the familiar superficial sense of who we are. We can really begin to strike a note that resonates to the essence of who we are. It's really our calling, our sole purpose. It's not just reiterating somebody else's experiences. It's really waking up to who you are. Does that make sense? It's like in your own way, your own genius begins to emerge when you can strike fa. And what is that conscious shock? What is the missing semitone? It's remembering ourselves. It's practicing self-observation and mindfulness and witnessing consciousness so that we can step back from and be less owned by a lot of our personality patterns, a lot of our conditioning and habit patterns. Does that make sense? And we have moments of that, don't we, when we work with material in a really deep way, if we can get past those resistances that invariably arise. Now, we'd like to think, hey, we just do this once, and then we're done. No, we keep going back through the scale, right? And there's things beyond fa as well. And what I just want to illustrate that in many transformational psychologies, there's this notion of a progressive order that makes sense, that there's some rhyme or reason behind, and that things need to be done in a sort of first things first sort of way. So let's try to unpack a little bit around these first 4 lessons of A Search for God. I'm going to try to strike some of my own fa here and not necessarily confine myself just to a traditional way of thinking of some of these words. So cooperation, at face value, sounds like it's getting along, right? It largely sounds like it's a social issue, social psychology issue, community sort of issue. Can I get along with others? Can I cooperate? And then maybe we extend it a little bit and say, well, can I cooperate with God? Even the affirmation for the cooperation chapter, not my will but thine. You have to cooperate with somebody else's will. But I'd like us to remember this morning that maybe cooperation has something to do with how we get along with ourselves as well. And that we need to be able to cultivate what might be called unlimited friendliness towards oneself. A kind of self-acceptance, a kind of openness, a kind of healthy love for oneself, that's part and parcel of cooperation as well. We're going to come back to this in just a little bit and look at self-compassion and how maybe we all could stand to develop a little more friendly attitude towards ourselves, to be a friend to ourselves more fully. The second chapter, Know Thyself. Wow, we could make a whole lifetime study out of that chapter, couldn't we? I want to suggest this morning that Know Thyself is particularly about discernment and being able to discern the difference between personality and individuality. And can we begin to notice and recognize what's coming from our conditioning and our karma, if you will, or our habit patterns as distinct from something that's coming from the deeper, more authentic, essential self? Can we begin to nurture that kind of discerning awareness? And this is where I think mindfulness and meditation comes into play so critically. I realize that the meditation chapter precedes all the Search for God's lessons, but then that meditation material needs to come back and inform each of the lessons, doesn't it? It's not just like you do the meditation chapter and then you get to the real stuff. Things about meditation and mindfulness need to come up with each step along the way. And I think particularly with Know Thyself, around this discerning consciousness, it's critical. And then in regard to what is my ideal, I want to suggest to you that making this more and more of a heart-centered activity is really important. So easily our ideals come from oughts and shoulds, or what other people have experienced in the way of transcendent experiences. Well, that sounds pretty good. I'll make that my ideal too. Or, my minister or my rabbi or my priest has told me this is what I ought to be like, so I'm going to make that my ideal. Or Edgar Cayce said, this is what your ideal ought to be, well, I'm going to make that my ideal. And there's a place for that, but I want to challenge us this morning to make this even a more directly experienced sort of thing. How can we make our ideal even more heartfelt? We're going to be coming back to each of these. And then in regard to faith, there's a big emphasis, if you look at that chapter in the Search for God book, around faith being an actual experience of the unseen. Not just there's a difference between belief and faith. Okay? Belief is a more cognitive kind of thing. And faith is more an experience of higher dimensions, of knowing the reality of something more than the three-dimensional physical world. And I want to suggest to you that faith has something to do with hearing our call. That faith has something to do with this business of soul purpose or personal calling. Now, my handouts in the packet are green. And if you look with me at one that has little excerpts from the first 4 Search for God affirmations. Okay, there's going to be 2 psychological inventories we're going to do later. They're back to back. And the other green sheet, hopefully on the side that doesn't have as much print on it as the other side does. Am I right? No? I guess I should have brought a packet myself, but. Now, these Search for God affirmations are really powerful. They're kind of long. They're almost prayer-like. I remember the first thing I learned being in a study group was it takes a lot of time to memorize the affirmation for the chapter. And some of them are so long it would take me a month or so before I really thought I had it down pat. And I want to suggest to you that most of the affirmations, probably all of them, are really embedded mantric phrases that have kind of been juxtaposed into a larger prayer. And that we can go in and from time to time find that certain phrases speak to us in a more potent way than do other parts of the overall affirmation. Has anybody discovered that for themselves? That maybe they begin to hone in on a word or a phrase within the longer affirmation, and for a while that's sort of the essence of what they're working on with that chapter, be it cooperation or what is my ideal or what have you. So, oh, that would be lovely, thank you. So I went back and I took these first 4 affirmations and I picked sort of little mantric phrases that kind of resonate to my message this morning. So from the cooperation chapter, I picked, as the call comes, here am I, send me, use me. That's a tough one to say, isn't it? And to really mean it. It's like, I'm busy. There's not a whole lot of open spots on my calendar. And okay, send me and use me. I've got between 4 and 6 on Tuesday afternoon free right now. And this little mantric phrase is a challenge to something much more radical, isn't it? And I want to suggest that for each of these phrases that I picked, they have currency for the whole program, not just for the cooperation chapter. Okay? So obviously, because I've already told you that I want to think of faith around our personal calling and what our mission is, and really knowing that, not just figuring it out intellectually, but having a sense of knowing it, that this expression here from the cooperation chapter is going to be relevant there as well. As the call comes, here am I, send me, use me. Then I picked this phrase from the Know Thyself chapter. May we each as individuals and as a group come to know ourselves even as we are known. I really love that phrase. I've always been so taken by that passage. I was in a lot of meetings here at A.R.E. We're 36 years, and there's always a moment of quiet right at the beginning. So I probably have like frequent flyer miles, tens of thousands of moments of quiet under my belt. And a lot of times somebody would be asked to say a prayer or lead the quiet time. And because we were gathered as a group, I would often use this phrase and invite the group to hold this for a moment before we begin a meeting. May we each as individuals and as a group come to know ourselves even as we're known. So if we can keep that one in mind sort of as a core idea for this morning. And then the affirmation for the chapter about what is my ideal has this, I think, very interesting phrase. Let me see in my brother that I see in him whom I worship. We'll get to this in a little while, but I'm going to suggest this is an invitation to positive projection, or what we might call in psychology, the psychology of admiration, and how sometimes in others we can see our own ideals, and that by allowing ourselves to admire someone else, it's really an ideals quickening experience for us. And I think this little passage, this mantric passage from that third affirmation speaking to that idea, we'll come back to it. And then finally, from the faith affirmation, help thou my unbelief in my God, in my neighbor. But what I'm focusing on here is in myself. Has anybody ever had the experience of just being sure something was in the readings and you go to look and it's not there? Yeah. So last month when I was kind of getting ready for this talk, I was just sure Edgar Cayce had frequently said we need to drop self-judgment, we need to love ourselves more, and it's not there, unless it's in the hidden readings that Kevin still has locked up somewhere in his bottom drawer. And I don't know, I think some of that may have been a product of the times and Southern Protestantism, but just the phrase self-love, whenever I could find it in the readings, was always kind of a negative connotation to it. And this was actually the best example that I could find, and it's in one of the Search for God affirmations, of recognizing that we need to transform self-judgment or lack of belief in ourselves, that we need to have compassion for ourselves. We need to believe in ourselves. And that's part of being able to have faith. That's part of being able to hear our call, to know what we're here to do. So we're going to do some work with these little seed passages. Now here's where the presentation gets chaotic. We're going to do some small group work. And I'm pleased we have a nice sized group this morning. We're going to work in foursomes. We are not going to count off because that would be really chaotic. We are instead going to use what I call the chaos method for forming our foursomes. And we're going to do several things this morning between now and noon with the foursome. And there'll be little prompts for what the group's going to work on. And for those who are with us electronically by video streaming, or people who might be watching this as a DVD weeks or months later, this is really going to be an opportunity for you just to do some personal inquiry and some journaling around these same issues. Or if you're watching with somebody else, you all can be a group of 2 or 3, or whoever may be watching together. I wanted to give you some experience of small groupness as part of this. So to me, to spend a whole morning talking about the potency of the first 4 lessons in A Search for God, and me just lecturing about it, really undermines the integrity of what the material is all about. It's really about learning with each other. It's really about may we as individuals and a group come to know ourselves even as we're known. So I'll have some little prompts for you. And I'm going to ask, in using the chaos method, and it'll be crazy for a few minutes, I'm going to ask that you try to find 3 other people that you don't know yet. And there's a few of you here that are brand new to A.R.E. You don't know anybody here. So it's going to be really easy for you to find your 3 people. There's others who know lots of people in the room, and you may need to look a little harder. We'll have a prayer first to be guided. And then after I lead us in this little prayer, we're going to stand up and we're going to begin to mill around the room. Now, I'm going to suggest that we leave coats on the back of the chairs. I don't know what to think about water bottles. You're on your own with that. You can stack them to the side. You can carry them with you. You can not care whether somebody kicks your water bottle off if you leave it on the floor. We'll have, but only if it's water. If there's something else in there, don't let it be kicked over. And you're going to walk around the room and you're looking for somebody that you don't know. Your hand's going to be in the air, their hand's going to be in the air. And if you intuitively feel moved, hey, you want to be in a group together. And if that person says, no, God told me not to be in a group with you, and just keep moving, you know. That's their loss. And you'll find somebody who'll say yes. And then when there's 2 of you, at least one of you needs to keep a hand in the air so that third person can find you. And then eventually, as there's a trio, somebody's got to keep a hand up so that 4th person can find you. Now, if we don't end up with a multiple of 4 in the room, then we can have, you know, a group or 2 that has 5. But I'd like to start off just striving to have groups of 4, okay? And then once you've got your foursome, we're going to ruin these beautifully manicured, orderly rows and just kind of create kind of a mass of little circles, okay? And we'll kind of stay with that for the rest of the morning, because we're going to go back and forth between me giving you a little assignment and then me talking a little more, and then I'm going to give the group another assignment, okay? So we ready to have our little guidance prayer to bring some measure of guidance to the chaos of finding our group? So let's just center ourselves. Maybe let your attention come back to your breathing for just a moment. And And first of all, just feel your own willingness to be in conversation with 3 other people. Your own willingness to share of yourself with as much candor as you feel comfortable. There's not going to be any forced intimacy here in the sharing. But just feel your own willingness to give something of yourself to others. And then maybe even more challenging, your own willingness to be touched by others, to have your own thinking influenced and modulated by the wisdom coming from other people in your small group. So first, just a prayer for open willingness. And then an intuitive sense of where in the room you're going to move to start finding your group. It may well be that the group's not going to come directly to you. You may need to kind of move around the room. And what direction does your intuitive mind suggest that you go? Amen. Okay. And we stand. We're going to raise a hand. We're making foursomes. How we doing? If you've got your foursome, please go ahead and sit down in a little circle. I see a lot of individual people, hands still up. Actually, once you have your small group and you've sat down in a circle, if you then be quiet, it's going to help us get everybody situated. Okay, we need one more down here. Here at the front to my right, we need one person. Need one person over here as well. We may have some other people trickle in, Sharon, so let's wait and we may be able to add somebody. You all will just start as a threesome, as a trio. We may have somebody else come in. Okay, we getting everybody seated? Okay, you all did a great job with this. I have my magic bells. So we could still use one person here and over here. So we have two trios. Well, right now we don't want a fifth. We got two groups of three where we need the... Is there a group that's got five? Could one of you come up here and help this trio become a foursome? Who'd be... Yeah, thank you very much. They're right here. Just... Here she comes, yeah. Thank you very much.
We've got five.
You've got five? Could one please join this trio so we have four in each group? That would be very helpful. Yeah. Lovely. Okay, here's the prompt. Here's the prompt for the first 15 minutes. Okay, we could do this all morning with people coming and going. So, 3 questions for the first 15 minutes of your study group. Okay? Everybody with me? Do I need to take off points? No, that's what I have to do. Sorry.
Ladies and gentlemen, may he have
Okay.
your attention, please?
Here's the here are the prompts for the first 15 minutes for your group. Okay? How do you find yourself here today? Second, share a time in your life when a small group was pivotal. I gave a very brief example of being in college, my last 2 year of college with my Search for God group. Which of the mantric stems from the green handout resonates especially for you right now in your life? Okay, that would be a matter of going back to those 4 A Search for God affirmations and the little mantric stems that I pulled out and picking just one and talking about why it has a lot of energy or resonance for you right now. I'm going to suggest that the way you do this in the group is go around and let everybody speak to how they find themselves here today. You know, that's kind of the 1-minute version of how I end up at this conference. And then a time in your life when a small group was pivotal. Maybe that's a little more than a minute for each person. And then give everybody a chance to speak to which of the 4 passages from A Search for God affirmation speaks to you personally with energy or resonance. Okay, so it's 9:52. I'll watch the time. We're going to take about 15 minutes for this. So you can jump right in. I'm going to suggest the person whose birthday comes next on the calendar goes first. Extra credit points for you.
Mark has a question. It's a very nice question.
Now, all the groups ought to be on the second question by now. Is that right? Yeah. So we have 5 minutes left, okay? Let's try to at least get through the first two questions. We got 5 minutes left. Maybe you can get it through all three. about 2 more minutes. Okay, about 2 more minutes. Okay. So please bring your attention back this way. We're going to stay with the group. This is going to be your spot for a while, even though we're going to take a break in about 10 minutes. Okay, have everybody's attention back? Thank you. Yeah. We know there's good things going on when people don't want to listen to me. Right? Okay. Because there's good things happening here too. Okay. So we're going to move into now a consideration one by one of these first 4 lessons in A Search for God, beginning with cooperation. And as you remember, I said earlier, I want to do a slant or an angle on cooperation today that isn't so much about cooperating with each other or cooperating with God, but how do we begin to cultivate more friendliness towards ourselves? How do we have more self-compassion? How do we have more self-love in a positive sense of what that can mean? So we're going to do several things around this, one of which is a little guided meditation after the break that I'll lead you through around cultivating self-love and self-respect and dropping self-judgment. But we're also going to take a psychological inventory. So in the packet, there's a green sheet. It says at the top of it, The Ohio State University. And then it says Neff Self-Compassion Scale, short form. And I want to describe this to you a little bit. And before you get started on actually filling out the questions, let me talk to you a little bit about this inventory. The difference between an inventory and a test, I think, is that there's not right or wrong answers in an inventory. Okay? It's a self-assessment, at the end of which we're always kind of compulsively wanting to know, well, where does this put me? You know, if I scored 17 on this, am I an enlightened being? Am I going to hell? Am I a genius? I mean, we always want the little answer key, right? And there's really not one. This is the kind of inventory that's best used multiple times on a single person. So you take this inventory and then you work on yourself for 6 months and you take it again and see if there's changes between your first time taking it and your second, rather than taking your score and comparing it to somebody else's right off the bat. Because as you'll see, we're going to be answering the questions never, rarely, sometimes, often, always. And your definition of rarely may be different than somebody else's definition of rarely. So you can't really compare your total score to somebody else's. So the questions are really means of interesting self-inquiry. Does anybody need a questionnaire? Okay. Yeah, okay. We don't want Gary to get down on himself for not having him in all the packets, so we're going to help him. I think we need another half dozen. Yeah. While we're working on that, while we're working on that, let me tell you more about the origins of this inventory. I hear music. Yeah, okay. Maybe I'm having a psychic experience. So here's an example. You remember? Okay. Okay, class. Wrap. Remember I spoke earlier about how if I had 50 more years to be involved in contributing to the Cayce legacy, what would I want to do? In terms of taking some of the core ideas in the readings and treating them almost like an internal scaffold, and what could we build around that, but maintaining sort of the core concepts as the key integrity of what we're building. So here's an example of this. Kristen Neff, who's a professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Austin, where I graduated, is a Buddhist. Mary Elizabeth reminded me of that. I had forgotten that. And she's a very respected psychologist. She doesn't wear her Buddhism out on her sleeve. She's really a researcher. And yet she took these core principles from Buddhism about compassion, and she essentially asked herself, how could I bring contemporary research and life experience in the 21st century and discover something and help people discover something about compassion? And she created first a long form of the self-compassion scale, and then there's this 12-item short form of it that's equally effective. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you to go through, just silently, these 12 questions. Each one you're going to answer never, rarely, sometimes, often, or always. You may be stumped sometimes. It's like, am I here or am I there? You know, just kind of make a decision for today. You can always go back and redo this. And after you've gone through all 12 of the questions, answering them for yourself as honestly as you can go back and you can see that each time you were picking an answer, there was a little number underneath the box that you checked. So for example, on question 1, when I fail at something important to me, I become consumed by feelings of inadequacy. If you picked often, notice there's a little number 2 under that often box. There won't always be a 2 under the often box, but there is for that item. So you're going to answer all 12 questions. And then, under scoring, Dr. Neff and her colleagues have 6 different subscales here: self-kindness, self-judgment, common humanity, isolation, mindfulness, over-identification. And there's a couple of questions that had to do with each of those scales. And you can go back and see how many points you earned on each of the scales. That sort of makes sense? If it doesn't, you can come and visit me during the break. So we're going to work on this for about 5 minutes or so. This will take us right up to the 10:20 stretch break time. You can then leave your questionnaire there on your chair along with your other stuff. When we come back at 10:40, we're going to pick up working with cooperation and how self-compassion and a little guided meditation around self-compassion can give us a deeper experience of this first lesson in A Search for God. So we'll just work quietly for about 5 minutes on this and the scoring of it, and then we'll just move to our break time. break, I'll go over again how the scoring is done on the scales. Yeah. If you can at least get the 12 questions answered. And then it's time now to do the break or break soon. And that's back in the mini auditorium for the break. So we'll start again at 20 of in 20 minutes.
Do we come back to our circle?
You come back to your circle. That is your home base now. Yeah.
gave me so many years ago. People loved it. Huh? Yeah. Man. Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
And they do a lot. They're going to do more than ever before themselves.
And Kristen showed me the whole thing too, so it's really like old. It feels so good to be back up here with you. It's amazing.
Better.
Yes, I agree.
There's some missing
Yeah.
elements.
Well, you're hitting that. It's coming.
The facility is really long.
Yeah.
It's like it's been gotten ready for the next 50 years.
Right.
Exactly what's going to happen.
The core needs a little work. Yeah. Well, we'll just
Are
keep
you in
saying.
conversation with Leslie Casey?
Yes, I am.
Good.
Is this mic working? Can you hear me? Good morning, everybody. This is just a brief announcement to remind you that before the conference is out, I will have the things you've asked me for from my presentation last night. I will have copies of the prayer of Father Giovanni. Can't hear me? Can't hear me? Okay. Before the conference is over, I will have copies of the handouts that you requested. I'll have the Uspensky questions from the old Search for God handbook that we discussed last night. I'll have the list of recommended reading. That was all the things I had on the table that you wanted. I will have a copy of the beautiful prayer that we closed with, written in 1513 by Father Giovanni. I think that's it. Oh, and I'll have Olive Lander's article on Gurdjieff Uspensky that I mentioned and showed you. Is that it for me? Okay, thank you.
You're going to keep that. Okay. Okay, hope you had a good break. We're going to pick up with cooperation. I'm going to lead you through a few things, and we'll have a small group discussion with our foursome. Yeah. I know there's some questions about the scoring, and we'll get to that in just a second. I'd like to lead you through a little reflective meditation time around cultivating self-compassion. So maybe we can kind of put things to the side and sit as you would if we were going to have a longer meditation time, although this will be just brief. And I'm borrowing some ideas here from Pema Chodron. Are any of you familiar with her as a meditation teacher? She's really extraordinary. And she's featured in some of her teachings about meditation, the importance of cultivating unlimited friendliness towards oneself. And the idea here is that a lot of times we sabotage our own meditation life because we get frustrated with ourselves. Anybody besides me kind of, oh man, I can't do this, or I'm not as good at this as I used to be. Rather than taking every single effort as doing the best we can and cultivating more self-awareness just by noticing what's happening with the mind. Just the simple act of trying to notice and being aware without judgment actually is deepening our meditation life. Some good things, so to speak, are happening just by that. Even if we don't hear bells and whistles, or like that music I was hearing earlier, or seeing any kind of light, or feeling like you're floating, or some of the more phenomenal things that can happen in altered consciousness. Just the simple act of coming back. Just coming back to a sort of a core belief in ourselves as a spiritual being, a certain patience with ourselves, a certain curiosity about knowing ourselves more deeply. She often instructs and this is kind of a basic Buddhist meditation technique, when distractions are arising, just to be able to name them. And as we name them, we sort of let them go. So a lot of my mental distractions personally are around kind of strategizing and planning and what comes next and what do I have to do today. And when I can notice I've slipped into that, if I can just name it, oh, planning. Oh, there's my worrying. Oh, there's my remembering. And just kind of labeling it and then letting it go. Coming back to my breath or coming back to my affirmation. Okay? So I'm going to invite you to close your eyes, and we're just going to practice this for a few minutes. It's sort of an interior exercise in cooperation with ourselves. Can I create an atmosphere of loving acceptance for myself? Let's begin by just letting our attention come to our breathing. There's pranayama-like breathing exercises that were recommended in the readings, but for now we can just be attentive to the simplicity of breathing in deeply and breathing out slowly. And what does it feel like just to enjoy your breathing? Just notice what it's like to be with yourself. Yes, you're in a room with another 100 people or so, but you're also with yourself. And feel what it's like to very intentionally cultivate an atmosphere of friendliness towards yourself. If you think what it's like to be in a really deep, sincere friendship with another person, there's a lot of acceptance, maybe even a certain playfulness around foibles and shortcomings. And feel your own intention to have that kind of relationship towards yourself as a way of cooperating. And just notice what a strong foundation that would be if you could move through life with that fundamental sense of friendliness towards self, self-compassion, self-care. It's not egotistical because it's not lorded over somebody else. It's this most basic cooperative relationship that we're capable of having. And then as we move into silence, if thoughts arise, just notice them without judgment. Perhaps label them or name them just as a way of letting them go. And then come back to silent attention to your breathing. Continuing to nurture this atmosphere of unlimited self-friendliness. Whatever comes up, it's okay. We just name it and let it go. And feel how it's possible to experience joy in your own presence. In other words, to enjoy being with yourself. We're not in a hurry. We're not taking a test. We're not trying to prove anything. Letting the in-breath be deep and the out-breath be slow. And just resting in that silent space. And if things arise in the mind, as they will, it's okay. Just name it and let it go. And then bringing your attention back. Now, I think in a lot of ways, something as simple as that is really the core of any spiritual path. The ability to just be with ourselves. Without judgment, without trying to make something happen. Finding joy in or being joyful with ourselves, enjoying our own presence. So as psychologists, we try to measure things, try to operationalize it. Bless the psychologists, right? So we did this little inventory on the green piece of paper. And frankly, what I'm most interested in, and this is what we're going to talk about in a few minutes, is the items themselves rather than the scale score. I know in today's society we want a number. We want to know where our number stands in relationship to other people's numbers. So we'll scratch that itch and try to come up with some numbers here. But then in the group conversation, what I'm going to ask you to do instead is to look back at the 12 items and talk with your other 3 members of your little study group about which 2 items spoke to you most potently about self-compassion and loving yourself and being present to yourself in a way that cultivates self-friendliness. But just to clarify a little bit about how the scale scores work. So Dr. Neff and her colleagues felt like 2 of the items on this 12-item short scale especially have to do with self-kindness. And so you could look at how you scored item number 2 and item number 6. That making sense? Do people see how there's little points that are under the boxes that they checked? Let's see how Mark did with this. Okay. So for item 2 myself, I checked always on item 2, so I get 5 points there. And for item number 6 on self-kindness, I checked a 4. So that's a score of 9 on self-kindness. By itself, that doesn't mean anything. I don't have a little table where Mark's nearing master stage, or yeah. The question is, if I go back and do this again in May, what kind of a score do I get? Do I notice changes happening with those items? That's really where an inventory has some relevance and some usefulness. But if you would find it interesting to sort of look at the subscales and see just within yourself whether you're stronger or weaker on some of these, you could go ahead and fill those in. There's the self-judgment items. Okay, so that's items 11 and 12. And for me, that was 3 points and 4 points. Sort of suggests that maybe there's a little more of a growing edge for me around self-judgment and what items 11 and 12 are talking about. Do you have a sense of how this could work?
Question, because of the reverse nature of some of the numbers,
Right.
does your 7 mean you're more judgmental or you're less judgmental?
The higher numbers is a more healthy place to be.
Even on self-kindness?
Yeah, they tried to control for that by reverse scoring it. So you notice that sometimes a never is 5 points and sometimes a never is just 1 point. So they were trying to control for that by the way they were assigning points.
So the higher points are the healthy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's okay. Okay, so we're going to go back to our study group. Okay, we're going to go back to our study group. We're going to have a few minutes to each talk. You don't need to be talking specifically about what your score was on any scale. I want you to talk about which 2 items out of the 12 were most resonant for you, where you're getting at, oh man, this is really meaningful to me. Whether you scored high or low on it, it really gets to the heart of what self-friendliness would mean for you. Maybe even some examples about when you do well with that or when you don't do so well. Okay? So we'll take 2 or 3 minutes for each person. So we'll have about 10 minutes or so for that. And we can jump right in and you all can decide who's going to go first. We're not going to do the birthdays this time. I'll watch the time for you. We're going to take 10 minutes to talk about self-compassion. Hi, and Happy New Year. So you all have packets? Yeah, we do. So we just did this self-compassion inventory.
Okay.
And they've all done it and kind of added up points with these subscales.
Okay.
And they're talking in the small group about which 2 items out of the 12 spoke to them most about being friendly and compassionate towards self. Okay? Yeah. Oh, thanks very much.
And also on the green sheet,
Yeah,
I gave out the
yeah,
first. So when you go to this one, the Freiburg,
yeah. That's coming up real soon. Do you want to have a couple of people ready to run around and hand them out to folks?
yes.
Okay. We'll just have people raise their hand. Good. That'll be in about 15 minutes. Good. Thanks, Gary. Okay, we have about 3 more minutes. Okay, about 3 more minutes.
Is that it?
Okay. So does everybody have 2 of the items in mind out of the 12? Hopefully you had a chance to do a brief report on which 2 you had picked. Picking an item doesn't necessarily mean you scored yourself high or low on it. It's just saying, oh, I think this is a really important feature about what cultivating self-friendliness or self-compassion would look like. So I'm going to read through these, and you get to raise your hand twice. Okay, you're going to raise your hand on the 2 that you spoke about in the little group sharing, and we're going to get kind of a room profile here about different items. And what we're going to see is different people have different needs around cultivating self-friendliness. So how many of you had as one of your 2, when I fail at something important to me, I become consumed by feelings of inadequacy? Okay. Raising your hand doesn't necessarily mean you do it or don't do it. It's just you know that's kind of at the gist of what self-friendliness is like for you, okay? How many had the second one as one of their 2? I try to be understanding and patient towards those aspects of my personality I don't like. Okay? Quite a few hands, but not as many as on the first. When something painful happens, I try to take a balanced view of the situation. Anybody have that as one of their 2? Okay, just 3 or 4 on that one. Number 4, when I'm feeling down, I tend to feel like most other people are probably happier than I am. Anybody? Okay, 4 or 5 on that. Number 5, I try to see my failings as part of the human condition. That one. Okay, about 10 or 12 on that. When I'm going through a very hard time, I give myself the caring and tenderness I need. Okay, probably about as many as for any of them so far on that one. Number 7, when something upsets me, I try to keep my emotions in balance. Okay, again, 20 or more people on that. Number 8, when I fail at something that's important to me, I tend to feel alone in my failure. It doesn't mean you're an advocate for this position. You're just saying dealing with that issue is right kind of at the core of what self-friendliness is about for me, okay? Number 9, when I'm feeling down, I tend to obsess and fixate on everything that's wrong. Okay. Number 10, when I feel inadequate in some way, I try to remind myself that feelings of inadequacy are shared by most people. Yeah, about 8 or 10 on that one. Number 11, I'm disapproving and judgmental about my own flaws and inadequacies. Again, these aren't people who are advocating for this position, but they see that's kind of a growing edge for them. And number 12, I'm intolerant and impatient towards those aspects of my personality I don't like. Okay, maybe 12 or 15 on that one. I think just looking at the items and being more self-aware around these items is more important than any scoring. Okay, if I said that?
What's the R next to some of
It's a reverse scored one. Yeah, it's a reverse scored one. Okay, we're going to move forward just so we can get through these other 3 chapters a little bit. So know thyself. If you remember what I was suggesting was an angle on know thyself, it especially makes it part of a growth sequence. Part of a growth sequence is being able to make a discernment between what is personality and what's individuality within ourselves. Can we begin to notice and be mindful of the way in which some of the thoughts and behaviors and feelings that come up are really very conditioned and habitual, karmic in the sense of repeating a pattern. We don't have to remember a past life for something to be karmic. It's a sense that it's part of something that's been routinized or made habitual, like on automatic pilot, as opposed to something that has a certain freshness to it, a certain connection to our authentic soul self, and being able to discern the difference. And we might think, oh, that'd be easy. And a lot of times it's not so easy. Now, I mentioned earlier Ouspensky's work, and there's this lovely metaphor or example he gives of a wheel being like the personality.
Very good.
I practice this. It's the one moment I can count on every semester where my students are impressed with me. I can never really tell otherwise, but they know that they haven't learned the technique of using your elbow like a, okay, anyway. So, what is it about a wheel that's such an effective metaphor for the personality? And Cayce uses the same word. He has this distinction of personality, individuality, which I'm suggesting for the Know Thyself chapter is right at the core of what we got to be able to see the difference between. Gurdjieff and Ouspensky and Maurice Nicoll are using the language of the personality and the essence, or the real I that lives inside the essence. So this notion of an individuality self, a soul self, a more essential I that oftentimes we're out of touch with because we get so wrapped up in our automatic habit patterns, right? Just to kind of be an automatic pilot, living life in a very robotic sort of way. So how can we begin to make that distinction? Well, one method is to practice what's described in the Search for God material as learning how to stand aside and watch self go by. You might remember that as a discipline. It's witnessing, isn't it? It's practicing self-observation or practicing witnessing. And what we begin to notice is that we have a lot of sub-personalities, or we might call them individual identities or I's that are around the rim of this wheel. And what happens in the course of a day is our attention or our sense of being identified with one sub-personality or one I keeps moving. And usually it's not because we choose to move, it's because things happen. Somebody pushes our button, or the stock market goes up or down, or an Arctic vortex or whatever it's called comes in. And things are just happening to us in life, and it's kind of pulling our strings rather than us really being intentional and making choices about who to be. And so this wheel, like any wheel, turns, right? And when we're on the rim of the wheel, it gives us the feeling that we're going somewhere. Many of you have heard me tell the story about the day I took our daughter Sarah, who's now in her mid-30s, but she was 2 years old, took her out to a playground, and there was this piece of playground equipment. It was like a merry-go-round, and it had a big central feature in the middle, kind of statue-like stuff, so you couldn't see across the circle. And I put her on this little merry-go-round, and I said, now hold on here to the bar. I'm going to take you on a ride. And I began to push this thing. And she looked over her shoulder as she moved away from me, like that arrow. And the look on her face was sort of, see you later, Dad, I'm going somewhere, okay? And then the wheel turned, but because of the way it was structured, she couldn't see across through the center. And you should have seen the look of surprise on her face when she came back around, and there I was standing there again. Okay? She thought she was going somewhere. And then suddenly, there I am, magical dad or whatever. But this is what happens to us when we operate just from the level of personality. We feel like we're going to go somewhere, and then we just go in circles. We end up coming back to the same point. And unless we can learn to sort of get off of the wheel, our lives just keep repeating, karmically, if you will. And so I won't ask for a show of hands here, but has anybody ever been in a job that they didn't like, and all the blame was on other people? You know, it was management, it was the company, it was other people, it wasn't myself. So I'm going to leave and go somewhere else. I can guarantee you if nothing changes within yourself, within 6 months or a year, you're going to have the same problems at the new place of work because nothing in you has changed. It's like 2-year-old Sarah being surprised when she comes back and there I am again. So I think the challenge of the Know Thyself chapter is, can we begin to feel this difference between a part of us that's capable of growing and unfolding and waking up, and the other big parts of us that are really just on the wheel, kind of on automatic pilot. And that takes a lot of witnessing consciousness. That takes a lot of mindfulness. In a lot of ways, I think that's what mindfulness practice or meditation is all about. It's beginning to be able to wake up and know ourselves more deeply. So, guess what? I got another questionnaire for you. So if you flip over the self-compassion scale, and this is my favorite mindfulness scale, the Freiberg mindfulness scale. This time it's 4 choices: rarely, occasionally, fairly often, almost always. And there are 14 items. Jump right in. Oh, some people don't have it because we had to give you the compassion scale. If you raise your hand, Maureen's got copies of the Freiburg Mindfulness Scale. For most people, it's on the back, but some people got a one-sided compassion scale. So if you don't have the Freiburg Mindfulness Scale, hands up and Maureen will bring you one.
Mark, could you show how you did that circle thing? You've got,
Maybe later. That's extra credit points. Yeah. So let me tell you how we're going to be scoring the Freiburg Mindfulness Scale. There's one item only that we're going to reverse score. That's item 13. All the other items, you get 1 point for a rarely, 2 points for an occasionally, 3 points for a fairly often, 4 points for an almost always. But item 13 is going to be scored the other way around, where rarely gets 4 points and almost always gets 1 point. Now, we're going to have a little group sharing about this, but I'm going to give you a sidebar discipline to do. The discipline is refrain from telling anybody what your total score is. Because invariably people start comparing in their minds each other's total scores, and you really can't compare person to person with this. This is another example of an inventory that you would take yourself multiple times and see if some of the items seem to be changing or if your own total score is changing. We'll see how you all do with that discipline, but that's what it is. Instead, I want you to go back and look at the 14 items, and as we did before, I want you to pick the 2 that speak most to you about mindfulness. In other words, if there were 2 of these items, no matter how high or low you scored yourself today on them, but these are the 2 items that get to the heart of what mindfulness means for you. Which 2 items would those be? And maybe circle those. Just circle the number on them. Now, here's what I'm suggesting. Those two items are pathways to greater self-knowledge for you, to know yourself more deeply. If you could intentionally in your life, over the weeks and over the months, cultivate doing better and better with the two items you just circled, it's going to strengthen your mindfulness. It's going to make you more discerning of what comes from your personality and what's coming from your individuality. And you would come to know yourself more deeply in the sense that that second chapter of A Search for God is talking about it. So I'd like our little conversation with our partners in our miniature Search for God group right now, just to share a little bit about which two you've picked and maybe how you feel like you're doing with those two recently. Okay? So I have just a couple of minutes per person. We'll take a total of 10 minutes for this. Okay, we can jump right in again. Did Elise need to leave for the rest of the time?
No, just for 20 minutes. She was getting.
Or just for 20? Okay, great. I was going to move them in with you guys, but we'll just leave it like this. This is fine. Yeah. You all doing okay? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
No.
on this other scale, were we just supposed to add these numbers? I noticed they were reversed. And
They
then-
are, because some of them,
and then-
yeah.
And then average them?
Or just come up with a total for each scale. And that can kind of give you a sense of where your self-compassion's stronger or maybe not quite as strong as you compare these scales. Yeah. Okay, about 2 more minutes. About 2 more minutes. Okay, let's take our little poll, just like we did on the other inventory. You've identified 2 of the items that really spoke to you as being especially meaningful metrics, in this case around the word mindfulness. So you get to raise your hand twice. We can kind of visually get a sense of sort of the rich array of differences within the group as a whole here. So how many have as one of your 2 core items about mindfulness, I'm open to the experience of the present moment? Just show of hands on that. Okay, looks like about 12 or 15. I sense my body, whether eating, cooking, cleaning, or talking, sort of somatic awareness. Okay, again, about 15 or 18. When I notice an absence of mind, I gently return to the experience of the here and now. Okay, using absence of mind as a trigger to come back, about half a dozen on that. I'm able to appreciate myself. A little bit of an overlap with the self-compassion on that one, about 5 or 6 on that. I pay attention to what's behind my actions, sort of noticing my motives, so to speak. Okay, 12, 13 on that. I see my mistakes and difficulties without judging them. Again, a little bit of an overlap with the self-compassion, 8, 9, okay. I feel connected to my experience in the here and now. 9, 10, okay. I accept unpleasant experiences. Okay, again, 8, 9 or so. I'm friendly to myself when things go wrong. Okay, half a dozen on that one. I watch my feelings without getting lost in them. 3, 4, okay. In difficult situations, I can pause without immediately reacting. Okay, lots of people on the pause, 25 or more on the pausing, yeah. That suggests a good study group discipline. I experience moments of inner peace and ease, even when things get hectic and stressful. That's what a lot of my students, I think half my students pick that one, maybe just their lifestyle. Yeah. So I'm going to reverse word this one. I'm patient with myself and with others. Maybe, okay, a few people did pick that one. Yeah, great. About 20 on that one. I'm able to smile when I notice how I sometimes make life difficult. That's actually one of mine, so I'm going to put my hand up on that one too. Okay, there was quite a difference, wasn't there? Which to me illustrates how we need to kind of customize even a tool like this and find the parts that really speak to us. And then we've got some measuring rods for where we want to sort of target focus our growth and development. But my thesis is, as you work with the Search for God material, that Know Thyself chapters, particularly trying to help you begin to discern the difference between these 2 fundamental sides of ourselves, and that mindfulness, or learning to stand aside and watch self go by, or witnessing, whatever you want to call it, is the core tool to make progress in that 2nd chapter. Now, moving right along, because we have only a half hour left, I want you to take the page that says core phrases from the first 4 affirmations of a search for God, and you will see that I strategically left open about half of the page, right in the middle, space where you could write something. Is everybody finding that? And the first thing I'm going to have you write is down at the bottom. I meant to add another line. If anybody wants to get in touch with me and Mary Elizabeth, if you go to markthurston.com, it takes you, do I know how to spell my own name? It takes you right to the Transformation and Courage website, to the bio page on me, and there's a place where you can leave a question or an inquiry. Okay, that being said, we're going to use the middle space of this page as a writing area, and now we've shifted gears towards the ideal. So what's an insight that we could work with this morning about the Search for God chapter on what is my ideal? Well, let's look back to the core phrase from the affirmation that came from 262:11. That third bullet point there. Let me see in my brother that I see in him whom I worship. What the heck does that mean? I want you working silently right now for just a few minutes to think of somebody who you greatly admire. It can be a person that you know personally, or just somebody you know about from afar. They can be still here in the earth in a body alive, or it can be somebody who's passed on. And I want you to write that person's name, draw a line under their name, and I'd like you to list between 6 and 8 qualities that you can see in that person that you admire. Okay, we're just going to all do that as a silent little homework exercise. People who are watching this video streaming or after the fact on a DVD, you can just stop and do that with us right now. The name of somebody who you greatly admire, their name, underline it, and then write between 6 and 8 qualities, positive qualities that you can see in that person. Now you remember that earlier I described something called the psychology of admiration. I think that's what this affirmation is talking about. Let me see in my brother that which I see in him whom I worship. Let me see my own ideals reflected in other people. Now we're familiar with projection, aren't we? But we usually word projection in a rather derogatory or negative way. It comes out something like this. The faults you see in others, the things that drive you crazy about other people, are probably things that are also in yourself or wouldn't bother you so much. How many of you have ever been accused of that? Or how many of you have ever said that to somebody else as a piece of advice? okay, there's a principle of truth there, but it's often a human tendency to word something in the negative. We could just as easily word it as that which we admire in others must also be in ourselves, at least in a seed-like form, as a lively potential, or we wouldn't recognize it. We wouldn't be touched by it so. So I want you to look at this list that you've made of qualities in an admired person, and in the spirit of the Search for God affirmation on what is my ideal, I want you to pick 2 of the 6 or 7 qualities that you put in the list that you're willing to sort of claim as a part of your own ideal as well. It doesn't mean you're perfect on that dimension. It doesn't mean that you do it as well as that admired person. Maybe you do. It's that you're willing to hold those 2 qualities as part of your ideal. Okay, just a moment to reflect about that, and then we're going to do some sharing in our small group. Again, we're just picking 2 out of the list. These are qualities I'm willing to claim and honor as being a part of my own ideal.
Mark, what do you mean by honor?
Well, to respect and be willing to own. You know, this is a part of me also. Just another minute to think about this. And then we're going to take just a few minutes, maybe just a minute or 2 per person on this one. You can say, if you like, you can say who the person was, or that could stay anonymous, but I do want you to share your list of qualities. What I want you to avoid here is getting off into a 5-minute story about the person. Okay? That's nice, but not relevant on the moment. It's instead, what qualities did you see in the person, and then which 2 are you willing to claim and own as a part of your own ideal? So we need to leave time for each person. We're going to take about 6 or 7 minutes for this. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay, about 2 more minutes. Try to give everybody a chance, about 2 more minutes. Okay. So, in the 15 minutes we have left, I do want to give a little bit of attention to this chapter on faith. And if you'll remember what I said at the beginning of the morning, my suggestion is that these first 4 lessons of A Search for God are a meaningful sequence leading up to something, and that something is for us to begin to experience directly how meaningful life is and how each of us has a calling that we can choose to hear and to follow. So with cooperation, I was trying to emphasize this morning that even though there's cooperation to be done with each other and with God, there's also a kind of fundamental kind of cooperation with oneself that often we skip over or we tend to forget. That cultivating a certain atmosphere of friendliness with ourselves is really crucial to be able to move forward in this sequence. And then with Know Thyself, I was suggesting to you that in that chapter of A Search for God, coming to know ourselves has lots to do with being able to make this distinction, this discernment between things that are of our conditioning and our habits and our karma and our past, as opposed to things that really are of our deeper, more authentic self. And that being more mindful, being more meditative, being able to witness allows us to make progress in that discernment. We could have spent a lot of time, and not just these 20 minutes, about the ideal. This thing on the psychology of admiration is just a little piece of how we could deepen our experience of an ideal. But because it's referred to directly in the affirmation for that chapter, I think it's important to remember that other people in our group, in our family, in our community, are often positive reflections for us of our own ideal, and being willing to claim that aid that's there for us. I'm going to suggest that faith, that chapter, can be the culmination of a sequence towards seeing life's meaning with a capital M, sort of how it all does make sense, but more specifically and more personally, how each of us has a calling. Now, it's probably this chapter or the core principles in this chapter that I work with more than anything else in my university work as a professor teaching 21 and 22-year-olds. The course I teach most often is on consciousness, meaning, and life purpose. We do lots of things around the science of happiness, theories about how people find meaning in life. We have a 2-week vision quest experiment that they self-design, where they have some question about their calling in life that they've articulated, and then some exercises they're doing across the 2 weeks to try to get some inspiration and insight about their calling. We're really working with this faith chapter in a lot of ways without getting out the little red books. So I have for you here a handout. If you'll flip over and look at the very last handout on the green page, that I'm hoping can give us some helpful tools moving forward to see more deeply what our own calling is. For some of you, this may be a rather novel idea that you could have a personal mission statement. Others of you are on your umpteenth iteration of writing your mission statement, and that's great. There's nearly 2,000 Edgar Cayce life readings where he sort of coached people and acted as a spiritual advisor around seeing what their calling in life would be. In many of those readings, he articulates the wording of a mission statement. In many others, he's just kind of leading them up to being able to write their own mission statement. I think it's kind of interesting to see how organizations can write a mission statement. So I picked 5 examples here. It works the same way for an individual writing a mission statement. Here's the Red Cross: to provide relief to victims of disasters and help people prevent, prepare for, and respond to emergencies. That's kind of interesting. You can probably imagine a committee of people coming up with that. It's kind of naming what they're good at, what their gifts and talents are as an organization, who they're trying to serve through their mission. In a similar way, our own mission statement could do that. Our daughter Sarah, who's no longer 2 years old and works for a DC-based NGO called Population Services International, here's their mission statement: to make it easier for people in the developing world to lead healthier lives and plan families they desire by marketing affordable products and services. Okay, pretty specific about what they're there to do, broad enough that a lot of different people could fit into that mission, but giving some focus to the group, the hundreds of people that work for that organization. Trader Joe's, a little bit different, not exactly an NGO. How many knew the mission statement of Trader Joe's? Put that on the pop quiz, right? To give our customers the best food and beverage values that they can find anywhere, and to provide them with the information required to make informed buying decisions. A little bit of an educative flavor to their mission statement. Yeah? Our center at George Mason University about well-being has this as its mission statement: to catalyze human well-being by promoting the science and practices that lead to a life of vitality, purpose, and resilience. And then I think this one's kind of nifty: Colonial Williamsburg, to feed the human spirit by sharing America's enduring story. Kind of different, isn't it? There's sort of a poetry to that. It kind of takes it at a deeper level than just, to reenact what things were like in the 18th century. So here's what I've seen in my study of the Cayce readings about creating a mission statement. What might this calling look like and feel like? Sometimes Cayce proposes it with an opening metaphor, sort of a core symbolic image. Here are examples of people who've come to workshops with me about writing a mission in life. None of these are verbatim from the readings. These are people like you that came to a one-day or a one-week workshop. To be a springboard to propel people and ideas to a higher expression. To be a bridge, someone who uses his sensitivity and broad-mindedness to create pathways for understanding and harmony between opposing sides. Somebody else, to be an anchor, creating stability and safety to myself, my family, and the organizations of which I'm a part. Interesting, aren't they? Some work went into these, kind of seeing gifts and talents, reflecting on one's ideal, but beginning with an opening image or metaphor. Another way to do this is to come up with a core focal point verb. So here's 2 examples. To synthesize and bring together the fragments of life into an interconnected whole. So this person feels like her calling is in lots of things, vocationally, avocationally, with her family, to be the synthesizer. Somebody else, to direct and manage people to bring out their best. Again, there's sort of a core verb at the beginning of the statement of the mission. Different approach is to clearly name the audience or the type of people being served or being helped. We noticed that in some of the examples at the top, such as Red Cross. To magnify ideals and aspirations in those who are discouraged or have lost hope. And you could well imagine different ways that mission could be lived, as an occupation, but also just a kind of way of being in the community and with other people. Another one, to use my resourcefulness and optimism to support and coach people who seek to transcend their disabilities. Again, right at the core of that is who the audience is they're trying to serve. And then another approach is to refer to key gifts and talents and skills that you're going to draw upon. To intuitively and wisely use words, written and spoken, to bring peace of mind and understanding in the world. Now, we're not in the next 5 minutes all going to write a mission statement, but I want to suggest to you that in many ways I think the A Search for God material is trying to lead us to a point where we see that more clearly. We don't just learn the universal laws, but we also see how we're here for a mission, we're here for a calling, and that all the work we're doing on ourselves in character development, which Search for God's really all about, is going to equip us and make it possible for us to be successful in that calling. I've left a grand total of 4 minutes for clarifying questions. One of which was, how do I draw a circle on the board? Okay. So the secret is not to try to imagine the whole circle. If you can just kind of get 2/3 of it, then the circle will sort of finish itself. Does that make sense? If you can kind of get a starting point and an ending point where you've got about 2/3 of the circle, you can kind of fill it in. And then you got to think of your elbow to the pen as sort of like a compass or a radius. Okay. So the question is, how far over, if you're right-handed, so Chris would have to do this the other way around. So tomorrow morning you need to, okay, yeah, okay. So how far over am I going to start? Maybe about 10 o'clock, maybe over at 9 o'clock, but I usually do about 10 o'clock. And then I kind of get a sense of, that wasn't as good as the first time, was it? Yeah. Okay. Next question. Anybody else want to have something clarified? Yes, please. Well, I said a lot of things right then. I think I used a phrase I hadn't used earlier about character development. Yeah. And I think we don't appreciate enough how critical character development is to spirituality. I think too easily we get lost in some of the sensationalism, which to me is kind of a shadow side of A.R.E. And I feel like I've been a part of it long enough I can speak to some of the shadow issues. And if we aren't doing the work of character development, I think we miss the boat. The next issue of Venture Inward is on psychic ability. And so I have my column in each issue. And one of my points I make in there is my take on what Cayce meant of psychic as of the soul. And I think soulfulness is about values and about meaning. So if you and I have a soulful conversation, if we left that tea or that meal and both said to ourselves, that was really a soulful conversation, it has little to do with whether there was any telepathic or clairvoyant information that got passed. It has to do with whether we were engaging each other at the level of our values and our ideals and what makes life meaningful. That makes it soulful. And I think that's what Cayce meant by psychic as of the soul. It's our cognitive faculty to tune into that level of ourselves and to somebody else. Your question reminded me of something else I wanted to say. Yeah.
Mark, is interesting. In our small group, we were the word. It's a 4-letter word, but it's actually different than you'd think. Wise, and knowledge, and I guess experiences. But that came up as being an ideal in our group, and I just want you to expand maybe if that's something that's worth talking about.
About wisdom or
wisdom.
Wise?
Yeah, because you don't hear that. You don't hear that often.
You don't. A lot of times we don't get to book 2, or that's one of the chapters in A Search for God about wisdom. And I think in Cayce's approach, wisdom has a lot to do with application, the difference between knowledge and wisdom. So wisdom is going to come from applied knowledge. Sometimes it's the school of hard knocks. I have my students read this book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. And I think it's one of the 10 best books of the 20th century. And there's something about the depth of his life experience that awakened a wisdom that everybody can really relate to. Now, you don't have to live in a concentration camp and survive it to be a wise person. But there's something I think it comes from really taking your beliefs and your principles and putting them into action. It cultivates wisdom or makes a person wise. So we're right at 12. I'm happy to stick around a few minutes if people have other questions off the record, but we're going to say goodbye to the people who've been on the video streaming. And you all have a great lunch and enjoy the rest of the conference, and Happy New Year to everybody.
Thank you, Mark.